Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. My guest today is Dr. Ron Penn. Dr. Penn was a longtime professor of musicology and the director of the Niles Center for the Study of American Music at the University of Kentucky. He specializes in American folk music traditions and Appalachia. He has written books on the music of John Jacob Niles and Gene Ritchie. He is also an organist and a fiddler. Correct?
I do both of those.
Okay. In 2025, as part of Lexington's 250th birthday celebrations, Dr. Penn participated in a concert at the Central Library that presented the music of Anthony Philip Heinrich. Heinrich is sometimes referred to as America's Beethoven. What you may or may not know is that he has a strong connection to Kentucky and specifically Lexington. Dr. Penn has been doing lots to educate about Heinrich and shed light on his impact. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Penn. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Well, it's absolutely a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here.
Okay.
I love the library above all things, and this North Side branch is wonderful. It's a beautiful facility.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to see you.
Well, thank you very much. That's great to hear. So just to get started, can you give us a little information on who was Anthony Philip Heinrich?
He's probably the least known, most important American composer in some ways of our early period. I'll give you his dates. It's one of those things that people hate to hear, their eyes glaze over when you say it, but it gives you a little bit of an idea of the time period, 1790 to 1856. So it was a long life that he had coming here in the 19th century. He was really our first full-time composer, musician that was American. He was American by choice, not by birth. He was born in Bohemia, and his uncle adopted him and put him in charge of his vast empire there that really consisted of banks, merchant houses, and Heinrich took to business well, factories. He even came to America to get a taste of what things were like across the Great Pond, went back home again. So he was very cultured, familiar with music from an early age, played piano and violin, had a Cremona violin. Of course, that's the cradle of Stradivarius and Guarneri and all of those people. So he was a pretty well-known character about town, but things went south. The wars that were happening in Europe kept happening in Europe, and that was not good for the economy. In particular, all of his business holdings tanked. Napoleonic Wars, just messed up everything in Europe as far as business and commerce. And so he came to this country, and not really sure what he was going to do here, but he had one trip before here, and at least they weren't engaged in, all-out warfare all the time. Found himself in Philadelphia, which is where, people emigrated frequently. Moved from there to pretty quickly to Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, he came to that place by steamboat because, they've got a theater and they want me to be director of the music and the theater. He got to the theater and it already closed, and it's just a good thing because it was a soot-stained, horrible place and not worth, being director of at all. Well, he didn't know where to go next, but he found himself going by flatboat down the river to Limestone, which is now Maysville. And from there, he traveled, basically walked and, hitchhiked and found ways to get, all the way through Millersburg. And he described all of the travels and travails of this, both in florid prose and beautiful music. And then he found himself outside of Paris in the beautiful bluegrass. And then he came to Lexington. And just within, I can't remember how many days it was, less than 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks.
Hmm.
He's already November 12th, 1817, conducting a concert in Lexington. And this is, pretty remarkable. There was a newspaper account talking about this concert taking place with one of the world's foremost violinists in attendance,
Hmm.
talking about Heinrich. So he did have a reputation as a virtuoso violinist. But at this point, he's just fresh to this place. There
Uh-huh.
was a music store in town that was connected, Wetzel's music store, that had some connection to musicians, amateur musicians. There was a theater company that was here, and they had some theater musicians as well. Theater and music were closely bound at that point.
Hmm.
So he put together a real concert in the upstairs of Postal Waite's Tavern, which was now Sanford Keen's
Right.
Tavern.
Hmm.
And at that concert, we have a listing of everything that was played. It was really adventurous music for Lexington. We're talking about the frontier town. This was the West,
Hmm.
this was not the South, anyone's idea of the South. This was the frontier, and this is where people were coming for all of the exciting developments. The East had gotten, crowded, but the more innovative people are traveling here, and this is where new ideas of democracy and politics are being trotted out. Henry Clay's Debate Society was upstairs in the same salon that this Heinrich concert took place. So this is the Athens of the West in the making right here,
Hmm.
and one of the building blocks for that was certainly this concert that took place at Sanford Keen's upstairs.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. He must have been a pretty good marketer, like self-promoter to make these connections so quickly.
He walked right in, but he had a good reputation
Hmm.
already, but, it doesn't travel fast,
Hmm.
it's coming from Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. How long does it take for that news to arrive
Hmm.
in
Right.
Lexington at this point? I mean, we fought the War of 1812, which wasn't over in 1812
Hmm.
by, any
Hmm.
stretch of the imagination. The Battle of New Orleans was years after that took place. So anyway, he gets here and quickly, as an entrepreneur, assembles an orchestra, puts
Hmm.
together this program of theater music and concert music, which were pretty much one and the same. You would know the names of the one older composer on that was Haydn, but Mozart was represented on it as well as a number of Italian composers who are lesser known today, but very important at the time. And so he had his finger on the jugular vein of what was current musically in Europe, even though he was here. He had not written a note of music himself at this point. There were no quote unquote Americans
Hmm.
writing music at this point. So, this is all kind of European music, contemporary European music.
Yeah, I read that he taught himself composition, so surely he must have used these examples from Beethoven and Haydn to teach himself about
Yeah,
that.
he was completely self-taught and
Mhm.
autodidact, and after this concert that took place,
Mhm.
and it was always assumed to be the first performance of a Beethoven symphony in the United States.
Mhm.
It turns out it wasn't. There was another one that took place in New England before that, I think in Boston.
Mhm.
But, I mean, certainly the first one in the West and the
Right.
first one across the mountains.
Mhm.
So it was a groundbreaking thing to do a Beethoven symphony within,
Yeah.
how did he rehearse and perform it, here in Lexington in, just over a week, I think.
And I think on the program it says maybe minuetto. Did he do the third movement of the
He
symphony?
did the entire
Okay.
symphony, but that was how they identified that symphony, the first one with minuetto.
Okay.
That's how Beethoven had identified it.
Okay.
So he did the entire one.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Do we know anything about how the concert was received? Did people talk about that or?
We don't really know that
Mhm.
except he wasn't run out of town on a
Right.
rail. He wasn't tarred and
Yeah.
feathered, and he quickly is performed. There was one note about hoping that he would remain in town as he appeared to intend to do, because he was a valued musical presence here. That appeared in the paper. He is also in Louisville and Frankfurt
Mm-hmm.
conducting, working with the theater company that was traveling between those places. So he was here
Uh-huh.
functioning for some months, and then he got ill.
Mm.
And it was probably, they thought it was the stress of all the travel. And so he went to nearby Bardstown to a log cabin to recuperate. And this is where the sobriquet, comes in, the log cabin
Uh-huh.
composer of
Yes.
Kentucky. He's living in this log cabin in absolute, isolation pretty much. And he starts to compose music, which he'd never done before. And he's absorbing the ideas and influences of this part of Kentucky at this point to weave them into a musical texture that really it's romantic before romanticism is really happening anywhere. He's very early at this because he's self-taught. He doesn't know, "Oh, I can't do that. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
there are rules against this.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't have to follow sonata form. I can write my own way."
Right.
And so the fantasy, the really imaginative kind of dreamlike way of representing this takes place rather than a really codified form. He's not writing symphonies, but he's writing symphonic or orchestral music, also writing piano music and songs.
Okay, and I was going to ask you what genres did he have particular genres he favored, instrumental or vocal forces that
Yeah,
he
I think at first he's mostly writing for violin and piano because
Mhm.
that comes naturally to him,
Mhm.
and it's a little harder, particularly during this period of convalescence. He didn't have access to an orchestra in Bardstown. He wasn't traveling, and he was just trying to, gain his strength again after all that.
Mhm.
So piano works, piano and voice, and there were a lot of those, and these were collected in his first large published edition called The Dawning of Music in Kentucky,
Mhm.
which is, ties it to our place, of course. After a bit, he finds himself going to the Speed plantation outside of Louisville, which is just an incredible large, Judge Speed had this huge plantation
Mhm.
and took him on, patronized him, his composition. He was allowed to live there. And in that connection, he met up with another friend of Speed's who was living close by, and that was Audubon. So Audubon and Heinrich develop a friendship that's a whole nother tangent, and
Mhm.
it leads to this huge orchestral piece, vast thing about the ornithological combat of kings and about two huge birds on this continent, uh, wrapped up in warfare with one another. But it's just sweeping, romantic, imaginative, brilliant orchestration and ornamentation. Nothing succeeds like excess with our friend Heinrich.
Yeah, and I also read that he incorporated some Native American influence into his music.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Can
and
you talk a little bit about that?
he did not use he loved the idea of the noble savage and the Native
Mhm.
Americans here, but he did not actually collect any of their music. He didn't use any of their tunes. He didn't weave those into it. He didn't use the rhythmic structures,
Mhm.
but he used the idea of
Mhm.
the Indians and just I noted a few of those. The Mastodon was a huge symphonic work that had movements like Black Thunder, the patriarch of the Fox tribe, and the Elk Horn Pyramid, or the Indians offering to the spirit of the prairie. So those kind of names were shot through it. Pocahontas, Pride of the Wilderness, was, Pocahontas was, of course, that name. If you knew one name in Indian lore at that point, she was the
Mhm.
one. Indian fanfares, a whole series of works now focused on the Comanche revel, the Sioux Gaillard, and the Manitou air dance. So they were like kind of Baroque dance pieces with Indian names conjuring up Indian ideas. So the Indian was more of a philosophical and aesthetic device than an actual musical
Mhm,
influence.
mhm,
Another influence that he used was African Americans, and he talks about this one event at great length, and it took place at the log cabin where he's playing a doleful elegy to his wife who had died by this point. And he's playing it on the violin, and this intruder comes in who happens to be an African American. And instead of meaning him any harm or any conflict between them, the black man just wanted to hear that music. He found it fascinating. And so Heinrich played for him, and they struck up a relationship. And so, here we have the log cabin composer
mhm.
pictured with an African American slave on the frontispiece of the engraving of the publication, The Dawning of Music in America. So he actually used the idea of the banjo in particular and wove it into pieces. There's a piano section called the banjo in one of his works, and it really, gets the claw hammer,
Mhm.
West African style rhythmic way of playing banjo in it. So he used more of that.
Okay. And so the Dawning of Music in Kentucky, is that a collection of pieces or is it a book about music?
It's a collection of pieces.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. There were two kind of companion pieces that were both published or exist in a modern edition, so you can
Okay.
get a hold of them. A lot of them were songs, some of them are piano, some are piano and voice.
Mhm.
There are no orchestral things in that mix.
Some of his music, his larger symphonic works, was he able to get those performed during his lifetime?
Ah, boy, that's the hardest thing in the world. Joe Baber, who was my composition mentor and friend on the
Mhm,
UK faculty for
mhm,
many a year, said, as a composer, make sure you always hold the door open for performers. Make
uh-huh,
sure you always tip them well.
mhm, mhm,
If you want a performance, it's easy generally to get a first performance,
mhm,
but to get a subsequent performance is really hard. And Heinrich was writing music that was uncompromisingly hard. It
mhm,
was really challenging because, he was not following rules. It was heavily ornamented,
mhm,
very chromatic, meaning that the harmony was not just simple Mozart,
mhm,
Haydn kind of common practice, but very florid, chromatic, taking you to far reaches kind of music. And so it's not easy to perform, but he became so well known
mm,
for his compositions. And the next thing we know, he's working in New York City and he's working in Boston. And in New York, he is the conducting and he's in the committee that forms the New York Philharmonic. So the oldest orchestra in this country,
mhm.
Heinrich's hand was
Interesting.
at play there. So easy enough, not easy, but,
Mhm,
he's getting a fair amount of performances at this
mhm,
point. In his later years, he becomes known as the Beethoven of America, not the log cabin composer, but,
mhm.
he graduates to being the Beethoven, and also known as Papa Heinrich, very
Wow.
affectionately, like Papa
Mhm,
Haydn, previous generation in Europe. So at that point, he's really a revered figure and conducting quite a bit, large compositions, large groups of musicians playing his music. And towards the end of his life, there was a kind of a retrospective concert celebrating his music with the chimes at sunset was a piece that he had written that's really like an autobiographical anthology of his music and his styles. It's a beautiful piece of music.
wow. I'll have to look that one up. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then it seems like after his death, he had some trouble keeping his music and, keeping awareness about the music. Do you know what happened with that? It seems
Um,
like it hasn't really lived on today, you know?
yeah. And I'd have to say that's part of that is the consciousness of, a rising middle class in America,
Mhm,
rising, growing larger cities. the notion of immigrant musicians were the ones that dominated the landscape. There were contemporary composers to him. These are all tangents, but you'll see they do tie together. The earliest musicians that really worked in this country were people like William Billings that have these singing schools where they're compiling music to teach people in the singing school how to sing, to get rid of that style of singing that was lined out, where a leader with a book lined out a line of text and the congregation followed them. They were illiterate or they didn't have books at that point. And it was compared to the, braying of jackasses and the hinges too long without grease on doors. So the singing schools were a way of dealing with that. And William Billings and a number of others are working there during roughly the period leading up to the War of Independence and through the 1800s. There were some immigrant musicians that came here to work, people like Alexander Reinagel, that brought a European sensibility to it, but lived here. There were some colonial gentlemen amateurs like Francis Hopkinson, who was Secretary of the Navy during the Revolution and one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he wrote string quartets and nice chamber kind of music that people like Thomas Jefferson and that era would have played. But with Heinrich, we've got something very, very different taking place. He's trying to be American, even though he's European. And that brands him in a certain way because if it's from Europe, culture's got to be good. It can't be good from, as a Frenchman once said about it, oh, the Americans, well, they're very good for steamboats and such like, but they have no culture. And a little after Heinrich, there was a movement by people like George Bristow, and they were trying to be American. They were writing in a European kind of style, but they're writing based on like Rip Van Winkle or the Santa Claus Symphony by Henry William Fry, who was also a journalist. So they're kind of holding up American music as we need to perform it. At the same time, the dominant music journal was saying, this is trash. What Americans are doing is not. So, that's the conflict. And Heinrich is a casualty of that, I think, in some ways. And so his name is not well known at all, except amongst, elite, elites and, musicologists and people. So he was rediscovered a little bit in the 1970s and by people like Neely Bruce, who's a composer and performer. He did his dissertation at the University of Illinois on him. So he, got rediscovered.
Well, and that's a great lead in for my next question. I know that you're involved in some efforts to kind of bring his music back into consciousness. So can you talk about some of those things?
Thank you, David. This lunacy about Heinrich, it's not the kind of thing I would ever have really cared about, except he was so flagrantly excessive and eccentric, and the music was so different, and yet it got lost. And Lexington, is near and dear to me. And I went, oh my God, Phoenix Park. Well, that was the Phoenix Hotel. That was the Phoenix Tavern. That was where Sanford Keen's was. That's where Postal Waits Tavern was. This was the place that was the cornerstone of our community right there. And that's where this concert took place. And I went, I've got to note that and do something about that. And so when I was still teaching at the university, got an idea, okay, I'll put a historical marker up. And that was, I think 10, 12 years ago, I started that. I did the work for it. They approved it, but fundraising, you have to put $2,500, and I didn't have that kind of money. And I hate asking people for money. I hate that worse than anything. So it languished. I gave it to a doctoral student to finish and it never happened. Of course, doctoral students being what they are,
Uh-huh.
they have other priorities. That kind of languished until I got involved in this public library presentation with students from Transy and EKU. Did that performance a year or two ago in celebration here.
Mhm.
And I went, boy, I can see it, that place where it took place right out the window of the library. I should do something about that. So I started writing people again, and they were kind enough in Frankfurt to allow me to use my old application so I didn't have to rewrite it. They were kind enough to not charge me more, even though the price of manufacture of the markers has gone up. And then getting it through the city is a complicated
Mhm.
process. And fortunately, I have a champion in Tom Eblin, who's the
Mhm.
temporary council member who saw the value of it and, kind of and talked to the park superintendent because it's part of a park. It has not gone through the council yet. It will be brought up at some point this fall, hopefully. So meanwhile, I'm fundraising. So I'm going to shake you down here.
Okay, yeah.
You know,
Yes.
how much do you have in that credit card inside your wallet there,
Right.
David?
Yeah. Yeah, people don't realize how much work is involved in getting a historical marker, but because in my work at the library, people will, from time to time, come in and tell me they're doing research on this, and it's quite a process, and it takes many years. Yeah.
Yeah. And this one's, going to be at least 12, 13 years probably.
Mhm.
I did one for John Jacob Niles, about whom I wrote a book, and I did it because Boot Hill, where he lived, the farm at the border of Clark County and Fayette County, was not being kept up, and it's in a state of disrepair, and I thought I've got to at least have a marker in case this place, falls
Mhm.
into the ground. And so it taught me what
Yeah.
markers were about.
Yeah, well,
I should have known better.
we're very appreciative of the work you've done to bring him back to focus. So, if someone wanted to become familiar with Heinrich's music, where would you recommend they start?
There's so many. I found it because there was one LP that
Mhm.
Neely Bruce had recorded.
Mhm.
But now you can go to
Right.
YouTube.
Yeah.
There are Neely Bruce, has some recordings there, but Artist Wodehouse
Mhm.
is one I noted in particular, had performed a
Mhm.
number of his pieces. And that's,
Mhm.
you can find it, a lot of
Yeah.
it on the web at
Right.
this point. But YouTube, I think, would be a good first
Yeah.
place to look. There are some websites now. There's Anthony Philip Heinrich Society.
Mhm.
So if you just catch that, there's a bibliography and timeline and some things that are accessible if you want to learn more about him. Of course, Wikipedia,
Mhm.
most people aren't going to want to read a book
Mhm.
about Heinrich, but if you do, there is a book that was published in 1939. That's a long time ago. Oh, you're looking at
Yes.
Upton's,
We have it in the
William Treat
Kentucky room at the
Upton.
Central Library if you're interested.
There it is.
Pay us a
Check it
visit.
out. It's available. It's really a terrific
Mhm.
book.
Mhm.
I can't see that work being superseded
Mhm.
by another book.
Mhm.
It was so well done at the time. Library of Congress has all of Heinrich's
Yeah.
notes, and he kept voluminous field notebooks and writings, prose writings, in the same way he wrote this elaborate musical style. His prose style is equally delicious. I'm going to just note one piece of music here in particular that I keep getting drawn back to. I'm not a bad pianist, but I can't play more than a measure of this without
Mhm.
working and working and working at it. It's called the Chromatic Ramble. The Chromatic Ramble. It's a dizzying rainbow of chromatic flourishes in this piece of music that goes on for, maybe 5, 6 pages. And he describes what he's doing in prose and along with what he's doing musically. So he's describing it. I'm going to read just a little bit of it if I may.
Yes, please do.
Among the flats and sharps, a tedious journey traverse, and lose yourself in knots of chords, and then those knots unravel, and then those knots unravel, and then those knots unravel, then sigh and die and faint in bliss ecstatic. That's the kind of character we're dealing with here. And meanwhile, if you listen to that piece of music, it's just, a lunatic piece of music, but so engaging.
Very much so. I agree. I mean, I think hearing you read that passage from some of the music I've listened to, it very much, you could tell that is the composer who wrote that music.
One of the things that Heinrich did that ties him to this country is he uses tunes that he heard and weaves them into his music in places where you might not expect them at all. And if you look for Yankee Doodle, you will find it sooner or later in one piece or another, among others. And it's very much like Charles Ives, a generation, three generations later. So it's already happening, that idea of tying a music to a place and a community and a time through musical quotation. Of course, that's something jazz musicians do and other people, but Heinrich was right there on the spot doing that.
Okay, well, thank you. And this is not just for the Lexington 250th. This seems like a timely interview as well for America 250th, because he's a major figure in American music, and I'm glad that people have a chance to learn more about him now.
He's our own. He has such a key place in Lexington history and therefore national history, and it puts us on the map once again.
Yes, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.